initiative, which is what generated this report, about EU foresight in the EU generally. Then we'll talk about the main body of the report and what challenges it identifies. And then we'll talk about the strategic choices that the report then identifies. So that's the structure of the talk. A few words then on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about foresight. Because it's used very much, the word, and the practice can vary. It can mean different things to different people. In our case, we're trying to look to the future, plainly. We actually set the time frame out to 2040. But the concept of foresight we work with is that it's a structured examination of many possible futures. That again has two important elements: that it should be structured. We should adopt a methodology to examine things rigorously, and we should recognize that there's not just one future that we're going to, but there are several different possibilities across a wide range. Some of them more favorable to us, some of them less favorable. So this is the key to foresight. Another element of foresight is that it's best if it's participatory, if a lot of people give inputs, if we can draw on the expertise, not just of one or two individuals, but of many, many people. Another point about the way foresight is handled within the European Union and emphasized in this report is that it's not an academic exercise. It's meant to focus on what the EU can influence going forward, and indeed what the EU can shape. We're not predicting the future, but we are interested in shaping the future. Also, we're looking for opportunities here. There are a lot of negative trends around, but we won't use that as an excuse to sit down and do nothing. We're looking for ways to find positive elements that we can drive into the future with. This is the fourth of several ESPAS reports, as we see in the next slide. And this series of slides started in 2012. This was the cover of the first report, done within the European Union Institute for Strategic Studies. The second report came in 2015. This was then it came at the very early stages of the Commission's mandate at that time in 2015. The third report came in April 2019. I was involved in this report myself, and the timing was quite deliberate. It was timed to appear at the start of the legislative transition, the changing of the guard, if you like, so that this was meant deliberately to inform debates around the creation of a new Commission and the creation of a new work programme, new priorities for the European Union after the 2019 election. So this present report has also come very deliberately in advance of the European elections, which have now been held. And the idea is that this should inform the discussions towards a new Commission and a new Commission programme, not least, and inform the discussions among the incoming leadership of the European Parliament. Inform in a certain sense. We would really like to give greater prominence to long-term issues. This is what foresight is about. So we want to go to a perspective out 15 years ahead and try to bring eventual lessons from taking a longer-term approach and then relate it to current policy discussions. Right, that's so much a little bit about the report. The institutions that are behind this report are 9 in number. There is the 3 leading institutions that everyone is familiar with: the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission. We also have the European External Action Service on board. The Investment Bank is involved, the Committee of the Regions and the Economic and Social Committee are involved, as is the Court of Auditors, and still the EU ISS, which has been part of this network from very early on. Now, having 9 institutions involved in elaborating this report is, on the one hand, it's a huge advantage for us because we were able to draw on expertise from people from these different areas. For instance, when they informed the discussions of what subjects to look at, when we had drafts of the different segments we wanted to address, we submitted them to people and were able to hold discussions where people with very significant expertise in the special areas were able to give us feedback and help us improve our draft. And in the end, all 9 bodies are behind this report, not in the sense that they endorse its contents, but they accept its publication and are helping us to distribute it and to talk about it widely in Brussels and further afield. There's a downside of having 9 different institutions involved. That is, there's a risk that the content would become kind of the lowest common denominator, that if someone somewhere was unhappy with something we're saying, perhaps we shouldn't say it. But I have to say that the structure and the format we use is to ask questions. So we are asking questions about what strategies should be followed. We're not delivering answers. We're not telling people what to do. This is not the work of a think tank, which has the luxury and very often will make recommendations at the end of their reports. We end with questions. We're trying to identify and clarify the choices ahead, not say that this is what we should do and this is what we should not do. So that's important to bear in mind when you're looking at our report. Right, I'd like to talk a little bit about the content of the report. And this is then already on the next slide. You'll see the table of contents, as it were. We have an introduction. We address 10 trends or sectors to identify how things might be in 2040 or where trends at the moment are going. We then come back and offer some strategic choices arising from these 10 trends. The choices themselves are organized by the STEEP acronym: society, technology, economy, environment, and politics, and geopolitics is the format for these choices. On these 10 subjects, they were chosen by discussion among the people involved, the steering group, not least, from the different institutions. You could choose a different 10 subjects. I'm sure there are things we could focus on differently, but this is a wide spectrum of issues that take us from economy to environment to political issues as well. Health is one that features understandably in the wake of the pandemic and so on, but it's not something that featured, for example, in the previous trends report 5 years ago, at least not in great detail. On the next slide, and this, I have a quotation which is from the chapter on geopolitics. We start with geopolitics and we end with democracy in our consideration of trends. And that's not an accident, because we see that in the domain of geopolitics, there are particularly difficult problems ahead. It's a time of great tension and conflict, exemplified by Russia's attack on Ukraine, but beyond that to a world which offers a lot of dangers ahead and is marked by a time of tension and conflict. And the quote I highlight here is quite significant because it sums up a little bit the EU perspective. The EU has a major strategic interest in working with others to tackle global polarization and to prevent an escalation of rivalries and antagonisms turning into open conflicts. The EU thrives with a peaceful, open, rules-based multilateral order. And that's what we like to see, but that's threatened on several fronts. In a way, you could say that the EU would like the world to be like it was in the early 1990s, but nostalgia isn't a strategy. So we have to relate to a new and more difficult international climate and perhaps adjust our way of doing business because of changed circumstances around us. So that's really the starting point for this report. I'd like to highlight some of the elements that arose when we were discussing, and this is a number of points to ponder. Firstly, a point that was new to me, but established by the European Environment Agency: Europe is the fastest warming continent in the world.
It's scary.
It's really scary. And again, throughout this report, the data we see on the environment, on climate issues, are really concerning. So that's the concerns that were already there in 2019, where the environment became a really headline issue of the 2019 report, and as you know, became a priority of the commission that came to power, came in 2019. The situation in many respects is worse now than it was then, if you consider global climate, the question of emissions and things like that. We'll come back to that, I think. Another point that we make here, and this is the point that We emphasize perhaps more than we have in the past that the green transition, the green energy transition is not only an environmental imperative, but also an economic one. Another point we make is that by 2040, the EU will have 17 million fewer people of working age than in 2023. And simply from that prognosis, demographic prognosis can be more accurate than others because of the way population works. We know how many 40-year-olds there will be in 2040 based on the number of 25-year-olds there are today. It won't be bigger than that number at least. And this reality that the working age population in Europe is likely to shrink should cause us to think a little bit deeper about the question of migration, for example. Another point that emerges is that civic space is being undermined in many countries. This speaks to democracy, so that's another area of concern. We have also in this report, in order to take a look at the 2040 dimension, we've introduced a number of vignettes taken from a separate project, a separate but related project of horizon scanning. The first point we include here is the question of longevity, and life expectancy is increasing. The possibilities, the medical possibilities of ensuring healthier, longer lives are really quite extraordinary. So there are many developments here, and these are positive developments. It's a good thing if a society has a high life expectancy, and Europe has. It's not something we should be ashamed of. And it's likely to continue in that direction. However, there's an element of inequality here because this positive trend is not emerging in the lower and middle income countries. So we see a greater spread of life expectancy from the most advanced economies to the lower middle income countries. So at the same time as we see progress and progress assisted by research and science, we also see a greater challenge from the point of view of equity, health equity in this area. Another example of a forward-looking perspective is the possibility that other currencies will emerge, or other powers will try to create currencies that can compete more strongly with the dollar as the international reserve currency, also in relation to cyber currencies, digital currencies. So that's just to flag an issue that's likely to look very different in 15 years' time than it does even today. Right, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the areas that we covered. I'm not able to cover everything in the time we have. This graphic, we use this graphic in our chapter about the climate, and it's a good way of depicting where we are and where we might be going. Firstly, if you're born in 1950 or 1960, you might not be personally engaged in how the world will look in 2060, but your children likely are. If you're born in 2020, you'll be 70 years old in 2090. And in this graphic, so that's an expression of a kind of a generational difference in how climate impacts people. And going forward, we have divided the graphic into 5 scenarios of prognosis for global warming. And even under the most favorable conceivable scenario, by 2060, by 2080, 90, the world will be much, much warmer than it is now. And on the worst possible scenario, on the worst conceivable scenarios, much more so. So the two elements there are, the younger you are, the more you need to be, the more you will be affected by global warming through your lifespan. And secondly, that even the most favorable scenario that we can envisage now involves a much warmer planet than we have now. There's every reason to remain concerned and to seek robust action to tackle global warming. On the energy side, which is of course related, we came across, we use this graphic, and there is a kind of a good news, bad news aspect to this graphic. If we look on the right-hand side, as I look at it, renewables is increasing. So there's quite a steady upward curve in the use of renewables in the past 20 years. That's the good news. The bad news is that that's not replacing fossil fuels. The fossil fuel source of energy are remaining about stable. A slight decrease in oil, but everything else more or less the same. So the use of renewables is coming on top of the use of the older classical forms of energy. So we're not in a transition of replacing fossil by renewables. We're just adding renewable energy on top of continued use of fossil fuels. This is a global problem, not restricted to Europe. And it also is, of course, it follows that Europe is one of many actors here and has to work with others in order to influence this trend in the future. I could skip forward to this, perhaps we'll skip this and go on to democracy. As I said, we started with geopolitics, we concluded on democracy, because also here there's fragmentation at a global level, but also within the European Union. So there's every reason to kind of think about democracy more closely. And democracy depends on several pillars. The threat to democracy is not just misinformation or social media, but there are threats on several pillars of democracy. The representation side involves credible elections. That is obviously at risk if you don't combat and have strategies to deal with misinformation. It also means having free political parties. It also means having a parliament that's delivering for the people, an effective parliament, as well as having robust local government. On the question of rule of law, another pillar of democracy, you need independent courts, independent judges. Absence of corruption is something that's very important. The more corruption you have, the more democracy crumbles. On rights, access to justice is important. Freedom of movement, freedom of the press, freedom of association. These rights are also fundamental to democracy. And in several countries, not just around the world, but also even in Europe, these rights tend to be more restricted or subject to increasing restrictions. And then on the question of participation, I mentioned the restrictions on civil society. We saw them even recently in the Republic of Georgia, a new law to make it more difficult for civil society to work with partners abroad. And this is also a way to undermine democracy. There's a positive trend here, that is, people are very engaged in political causes, in social causes. We see that among young people, not least, also related to the climate and the environment. And we see a great growth of citizens' assemblies, participatory democracies. So there's reasons to be optimistic too about trends showing that people want to improve their society, or prepared to work in order to do that. So with that, we've done a quick tour of the topics, the 10 topics we addressed in this report, and now we come to the strategic choices that arise from that. I'll just skip through them bit by bit. As I said, we use the steep categories. So here we have geopolitics followed by the environment. And we phrase these questions. There was a lot of discussion about how to sum up this report, what questions to put, how to phrase the question. And we are living in a political context as well. We're not in the business of giving recommendations. We do want to identify options. And here we found that I think most of the options, most of the questions that we have here probably correspond, or they probably map reasonably well onto the political priorities of the main centrist, centre-right, centre-left, centrist political parties in Europe, I would say. They might not be mapped so well with extreme parties on the right or left. I think we're somewhere, the world we see is or the options, the strategies we talk about are probably compatible with mainstream opinion in some ways. That's not to say there aren't different choices to be made and that there won't be different debates between these, even between these parties on what's right and what's what to do. But broadly speaking, I think it's possible to find a consensus on these on many of the choices we identify. First, on geopolitics, how can the EU establish itself as a smart global power? I'm still on yes. Able to navigate in an uncertain geopolitical landscape, acting with partners where possible and autonomously where necessary. The word smart is quite significant here. We're not talking about hard power and soft power as alternatives for the EU. We think that the the option to consider is how to be smart in international affairs. And that is also the last phrase there about acting with partners where possible and autonomously where necessary might be a way of finessing the current debate on strategic autonomy or European sovereignty and the difficulty of working out what does Europe need to be able to do itself, and how much can it rely on external partners, to what extent does it need new partnerships with other actors in order to influence world affairs in the direction the European Union wants to influence those affairs. On the green transition, again, we're not into a debate on, should there be a green transition or should there not be. That debate is largely over. But the question is, how can it be achieved in an effective way, first, and secondly, in a socially and economically equitable way. This is a little bit of a new element, I think, or at least it's emphasized more strongly in this report than 5 years ago, because without social and economic partnership in this entity, in this enterprise, there's likely to be more resistance. We'll come back to that in a minute. The next options we see are under the economic chapter. To what extent are EU policymakers willing to accept economic risks and frictions in exchange for enhanced geopolitical and technological sovereignty? Another way to say that is that if we want to de-risk our economic supply chains, there is an economic price for that. You're not necessarily buying products and raw materials where they're cheapest, but where they're more reliable, and that might mean higher input costs. Equally, and this generally is a dilemma, or it's a trade-off involved in the economic policy area and in trade, not least. And the next question here is the EU's current economic model, still on the economic model, fit for purpose, or does it need a major overhaul to ensure long-term stability, sustainability, and well-being? So there are large questions to be asked about what kind of economic model suits Europe best at this time. I think you can see a tendency to move, for example, towards more interventionism, perhaps coinciding with Britain's exit and France's greater influence on European affairs. But again, this debate is arising and it is on the table now. Okay, on the last couple of strategic questions, how can the EU ensure that its regulatory framework in relation to technology, how can it achieve not one but three goals? You want to incentivize innovation, you want to encourage people to seek innovation and to develop new technologies. How can you do that and then deliver economic benefits? You're not doing innovation for its own sake, you want it to deliver economic benefits. Indeed, you want to diffuse the economic benefits arising from new technology. And at the same time, you want to safeguard against potential harms. So there are three big targets, three big goals that you need to address in relation to technology. And each of them is quite difficult. Europe is behind in many areas, cutting edge technology areas compared to both the US and China. So there's a whole series of dilemmas in relation to technology that really need to be worked out. And finally, on the to bring it back to social and democracy context, the question arises how the EU can strengthen opportunities for its citizens to prevent social fragmentation, because we identify social fragmentation as a threat multiplier, to consolidate support for the coming transitions. And to what extent can social protection instruments help to mitigate the anti-democratic tendencies that we see around the world, but also in Europe. So with that, we've delivered a report that we hope gives food for thought. Again, it provides questions more than answers, but it's based on a lot of consultation across the institutions. It does have a Brussels perspective to start with, although we took inputs from the Committee of the Regions and others who have perspectives far beyond the Brussels bubble. It's also based on a lot of preceding work done within the respective institutions. The European Parliament Research Service, where I work, we've done future shocks reports for the past number of years. In the Council, they have a new analysis and research team that is also part of our Foresight network. In the Commission, with the designation of Mara Šefčovič as Commissioner for Strategic Foresight, they've done strategic foresight reports each year since then. And that's backed up with an annual report from the Joint Research Centre in more detail, and the last one being focused on the question of a fair and sustainable Europe, and then other inputs. So we've drawn on a wide range of inputs from the past several years and tried to synthesize it in a quite short report, excluding a lot of things, obviously, but offering it as food for thought for the decision makers now after the European elections who are coming in to take important positions in the European Parliament and who are candidates for President of the Commission and the Commission that will be appointed in the coming months. So that was our work, and I hope it was a useful introduction.
I think it was very interesting and very scary to some extent. I invite the colleagues which are connected to raise the hand, and I would like to invite to have today also an open debate among us, because I think the trends, the topics are somehow of concern, but also focus of our daily job. I would like to start with while the colleagues decided to intervene and to break the ice between us and the listeners. My question is, you issued this report in April, which means a couple of months before the big change that we're going to have in the management of the European system, because we are going to have soon, I mean, the new parliament is basically composed now. Everyone has seen the result of the elections, and of course, out of the new parliament, we are going to have a new European Commission that is going to implement politically what will be possibly the new trends at European level. I mean, this report is very interesting in my opinion, because it highlights seeing things that are going in continuity, if you want, to a current trend, even if highlighting some worrying issues that I also wasn't aware, like the fact that despite we are increasing the use of renewables, that everyone is selling as a big outcome, the reality is that we are basically still using the same amount of fossil fuels, which is not very reassuring. So the question is how you're planning to hook this report with the new decision makers that probably will enter the parliament without even knowing about its existence.
The first thing is that we can, because this is the product of a coordination and cooperation between different institutions, we have the opportunity of presenting it widely in the institution. So already the report was on the Parliament side, Vice President Jean-Marc Angel was involved and circulated the report to his colleagues then when it was adopted already. And on the Commission side, Mara Šefčovič, as Commissioner for Strategic Foresight, was also involved. So both of those figures then circulated Šefčovič to his colleagues along the Commission. So it's already been disseminated also at senior political level, and that's been accompanied by a very extensive program of presentations within the institutions individually and to other audiences as well. So we have done a lot to make people aware of the report in the institutions and in the corridors around. Now we have a changing of the guard, but there is a certain amount of continuity as well. Some of the Commission, some of the commissioners may continue, some of the senior European Parliament figures likely to continue. Jean-Marc Angel, in fact, returns to the Parliament, and so on. So there has been kind of groundwork done to introduce the report to audiences that we hope will find it relevant. We're also talking to the people who advise the people who make decisions. That's a way to at least spread the awareness of the issues we identify and prompt, again, thinking about the choices that will need to be made. The idea is, in contrast to perhaps some other inputs, is that we are trying to highlight the longer term, and that has different consequences for the immediate strategies and decisions than perhaps if you're only looking at what happens this year and next. So I think with the spread of the dissemination program through the 9 institutions, I think, and outside that, we have a possibility of making sure that people are aware of the report and hopefully are able to engage with its content.
there is, I feel no open questions. Please feel free to intervene. You have to just write your name on the Q&A box, and I will be very happy to open the microphone. So don't be shy. Put your reflection on the table. Let's explore the next 26 minutes in a also constructive way to confront, share and network on the thing. When it comes to the previous ESPAS reports, you also somehow forecasted the trends up to 2030 and so on. First, my question is, you got them? And second, are you satisfied about the impact generated by the previous reports? So to maybe also put faith in this one to be an impactful one?
Yeah, that's a very key question. I think I can't speak too much about 2015 because I wasn't involved. I joined in 2015 when that report had been published, and its impact was more to encourage the institutions to create structures, create capacity to do more strategic foresight. The unit I joined and continues in the research service was created at that time in order to work more on trends and foresight. So it kind of contributed at that level, certainly. The 2019 report, I feel, did have an influence somehow on the priority setting of the commission that was then established, the Van der Leyen Commission. I say that because we identified in that report about 7 priority areas, and they overlap quite closely with the 6 priorities identified by the Van der Leyen Commission. Now, that's not causation, but it is correlation. And I think that what the previous report showed was that it reflects the thinking around Brussels and a little bit wider about the issues in front of us. And the 2019 report did that, and it wasn't, to my mind, a coincidence that the issues it talked about and highlighted corresponded quite closely with the issues that became the priorities of the Van der Leyen Commission. But as I said, correlation rather than causation. But from that, I would suggest that also in this report, we are addressing the issues that are in people's minds in Brussels, and I would expect that the next Commission will be addressing these same issues, whatever direction they want to take, whatever order of priority they want. That's beyond our scope, plainly. But I think there will be an overlap again between the issues we're highlighting here and the issues that the incoming Commission will be addressing. So I think it's a useful input like that, and I think people do read it and pay attention to it. It helps, in my view, that we're actually not coming to say you must do this or this or this. If we did that, we would be invited to leave the room. So instead, we're saying these are issues that this is how far we've come with these ones, and we need to think more about them.
Yeah, then let's mix up my monopolization of questions with the guest. So Tobias Badestrom from Norge, a Norwegian colleague. So Tobias, we are going to allow you to speak in 2 seconds. You should be able now to open your microphone and camera and pose your question to Noah. To Eamonn. Eamonn is name and Noah is his name.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you just put the microphone in front of your mouth because you're a bit far.
Better now?
Definitely.
Yeah. Yes, very interesting talk. Thank you very much. I'm Tobias Badestrom from NORS, Norwegian Research Center. So I have a classical question, I suppose. To achieve green transition and strengthen European industry, you need the support of the citizens and the regions, as you indicate, while China and to some extent the US are less dependent of this, or at least they do not emphasize this aspect as much. So is the solution?
And we will never know.
Those green solutions.
Yes,
thank you.
We have lost you for a second, and there is a solution. And then you blocked. So can you repeat the question? Yeah.
So is the the solution simply to convince the politicians and companies that future economic growth will be found in the green sectors and solutions? Thank you.
Yes, I think the answer fundamentally is yes. In our report, we do point out the question of false economies. And a false economy is if you avoid expenditure today, and yet by doing so, you will then face far greater expenses in the future. And that is the case, we feel, with climate change and with the green transition. The data suggests that the impact of climate change is becoming stronger and stronger. You see the example of extreme weather conditions, flooding and fire. That has an effect already being seen on insurance premiums, or even in the case of parts of California, insurance companies refusing to withdrawing insurance offers for certain areas because of the risk of natural disasters. So there are real economic costs arising from the way the environment, with the way climate change is happening. If you talk about drought in Southern Europe, the risk of drought in Southern Europe, the impact of that can be significant, and there are several other very concerning trends and possibilities arising from what we know of climate data. And that, so it genuinely is, this is where foresight can be a resource, because it's a way of reminding people that, no, we can't simply, by avoiding costs today, we can't simply imagine everything will be fine. This is an area where there will be growing costs, and the preventive principle has to come in this area in the same way as it applies in healthcare, for example. So that's an important point to make, and we try to, the material in our report supports that point of view for sure. The area of technology is an interesting one, because I appreciate that Massimo felt the report is scary, and there are a lot of trends that are going in the wrong direction. That's plain, unfortunately. But there are areas where we can act to improve things. We talk a little bit about the concept of gain multipliers. So you have threat multipliers where you should try to prevent something that will cause knock-on effects in other areas. War is a threat multiplier. Also, if you avoid costs related to security today, that might mean you have far higher costs related to security tomorrow, another area of false economies. But a gain multiplier is something where you can act and then produce gains in other sectors as well. And effective clean technology is that kind of area, because it can help in relation to climate. It also creates jobs and profits, and it also gives resources that can be shared with other partners, developing countries, for example, that have this dilemma of needing to have economic development without having access to clean technologies, for example. So these are, so I would say clean technologies is an area where Europe has a certain expertise. It's more open to adapting green technologies than either the US or China, according to the surveys we see. And that's certainly an area of potential for solutions to emerge rather than more and more problems.
Very interesting. Meanwhile, another question is arrived from my friend Ignazi. So Ignazi, we are going to give you now the possibility to intervene. So feel free to pose your question and showcase yourself. So Ignazi is the responsible of Alliance por Universidades Arizona Brussels. Ignazi, the floor is yours. Open your camera and mic. Yes, there you are.
Can you see me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. So yeah, I mentioned the question actually that you say in the report that integrating long-term goals into short to medium-term decision making can boost our chances of leaving a world that is in better shape to the new generation. My concern is that I see that lots of institutions in Europe are becoming more and more complex when constituting their parliaments or their governments, and I mean more different political parties are part of the decision making. So that, for me, it makes that to reach an agreement or to reach consensus for what we say is medium-term decision making would be much and much more difficult in the near future. Maybe, like this month coming, even constituting the European Parliament reaching great or bigger kind of consensus. How do you see that? Because I think that one of the problems would be, given the challenges you mentioned into the report, to actually design proper policies to tackle these challenges. What's your opinion on that? Thank you.
Challenging question.
Yeah, that's again a very crucial question. And we have the results of the elections now, and we see some shifts in the representation of the European Parliament. Not huge shifts, but losses in the Liberal group, in the Social Democratic group, and in the Greens, and then gains on the right-hand side, to the right of the EPP. So there is a movement that reduces, I guess, the strength of the centrist bloc of parties in the European Parliament, and that means it'll be harder for the Parliament to establish strong positions and strong consensus on difficult issues, as you suggest. But there are two things I would say about that. First, on the question of consensus, insofar as the Parliament is a key actor here, which it is. It remains the case that the centrist bloc, which has been called the Van der Leyen Alliance, or the Van der Leyen Coalition, the EPP, Renew, and then the Social and Democratic parties, still command a majority of the hemicycle. Less than before, but that can have a kind of a contradictory effect in parliamentary affairs. If you have a smaller majority to go on, you are condemned to be more cohesive and to work together. You have less scope to diverge in a way. We'll see how that works out at any rate. It's a challenge, certainly, and the nomination of the President of the Commission will be the first test of this, of the mathematics and the power of a cohesive central bloc in the European Parliament. But beyond that, there is an issue that we try to emphasize in this report, I think perhaps more than in its predecessor. That is that social fragmentation in its own right is a problem, and it has become worse over time around the world. America is a good example of that, and also in Europe. And we therefore need to think of ways to address social fragmentation. Now, that's beyond the power of the European Union, in the sense that the European Union has very limited competences with relation to taxation, which is a national competence, and it has very limited competence in relation to social policy, again, still largely a national competence. So in these classical areas of governance, the European Union as European Union has kind of limited tools. But we do see, and it's reflected in the report, that there is a need to pay much attention to social fragmentation within as a dilemma more than before, and to find ways to assist also the member states to get in front of the problems that arise when you take away social solidarity, you take away cohesion, and you have divided societies against itself, fragmented society. The fragmentation makes it more difficult to achieve almost any of our goals, more difficult to achieve consensus on green transition, more difficult to achieve consensus on how to respond to Russian aggression, more difficult to find support for technological change, and so on. So I think the emergence of social fragmentation is something that people need to think about. Also at EU level, we need to think about more closely about that. There was some suggestion a few years ago that there might be a social turn in this commission. I'm not quite sure if it's the case that has happened, but it seems that there is there are good reasons to consider whether the incoming commission needs to have a clearer profile on questions of social solidarity and cohesion than it has had in the past. That's an open question. That goes beyond the scope of our report to some extent, but we do flag this as a matter of concern.
Yeah, and I would like also to add a consideration, also to provoke a further reaction from you on this. I mean, thank you, meanwhile, Ignazi, for your participation. My question is linked to what Ignazi is saying. I mean, on one side, at the end, as you correctly underlined, the parliament's majority is not going to change too much, meaning that politically we can have a more difficult continuity to what has been the previous legislature, and the new legislature will probably try to follow the political path that has been started when the previous parliament was put into force. What I see as a problem to come, probably quite soon, looking, for example, to the result of the elections in France, is the different composition of the council. And we know exactly the problem that could raise when you have a parliament and a council which are totally in opposition, because apparently the far right is getting governance power in important countries. So how do you see in perspective? We will soon discover what is going to happen in France, because Macron has just launched the new elections by the end of June. So soon we will know if France is somehow aligned to a center left, center right balance, or if it's going to move to a far right. Italy is already, if you want, a little bit more on the right side instead of the center side. Hungary is for long in this trend. So how can we figure, according to a forest side, a decision-making process in which you have a parliament which is more, let's say, centered, and the council which is moving in a more convenient, more direct way to the right side?
And that's, well, the relationship between the council and the parliament have evolved, and I think in a way, perhaps classically, there's been a tendency to look for the parliament to be the watchdog of the council and tendency, finding fault and in kind of opposition. But over time, as Europe has developed, I think there are far more significant links across the political groups. So the political groups in the council are in contact with their counterparts, their ideological party colleagues in the parliament, and so on. And you do find more cohesion, I think, because of that. The council already has governments of a centre of a far right character, and whether that will change significantly in the French election, so on, it remains to be seen. But I think there's the institutions work through consensus building. And this is a long, something that it has always done for decades. And it's a process, and it's frustrating, and it takes time, and it sometimes doesn't succeed the first time or the second time. Journalists are always looking for an immediate headline: you haven't solved this problem, therefore the entire council is a failure. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I think already you see that, for example, even a situation where you had a Hungarian government that was clearly more friendly to or more open to the interests of Moscow than any of the other governments, it eventually has accepted series after series of sanctions against Russia. So there is a longer term perspective that the council is still able to find consensus. It takes time, it's difficult, but there's a process that continues in Brussels of building consensus. Also when there are new parties in power and new parties representing the council. I think that process will continue. I think the long-term perspective that we bring in when we talk about foresight can actually help to develop consensus, because we're thinking of problems that won't go away from today to tomorrow. New parties also need to address what world they want in the future. Once they get into office, whether it's the parliament or the council, you can also realize that the slogans that got you there aren't solutions to the decisions to the problems you have to make decisions on. So, you know, I would still be optimistic that the European Union as a process has the ability to find consensus, even if the range of opinions around the table and in the Parliament is more fragmented than it has been before. This, of course, remains to be seen, but you know, there is a dynamic, and the problems are such that they do need to be addressed. And it's a question of trying to identify where there are areas where consensus can be established.
I like very much your optimism about the future, because of course this could be an issue for our decision-making capability in terms of fast decision-making and time which we need fast decision-making. I would like to come, meanwhile, I would like to tell to our colleagues still connected that I suspect we have time for one question or two from your side, so feel free to intervene. But meanwhile, I would like to come back to the report, and especially on the fact that you underlined that innovation is one of the challenges, and has been since long. I mean, Moedas was a commission really focusing on increased innovation. Before Moedas, someone else who was also pushing for innovation. The current commission is very keen on doing innovation. And this needs to be incentivized in the Euro regulatory framework. But what I discussed in recent time with Mr. Letta during a dinner which I was invited to have an initial insight about the single market report was, and it just highlighted it without anticipating anything. But I provoked him on the fact that innovation is nothing without research. Because you need to have the grass, you need the seed. You know, that's the point. And I really liked the fact that in the report of Mr. Letta, the fifth freedom, the importance of focusing on the fifth freedom came out. Well, I haven't seen it in your report. I mean, the research innovation is somehow in between the lines, you know? But you haven't touched upon the future trend, which in reality will be very important. I mean, we need research innovation for health, because the new elderly will be subjected to a lot of high raising of temperatures, and we know what are the effects of temperatures on the elderly. We need to further accelerate on the renewable development to make this technology efficient enough to substitute the fossil fuel, which according to the supply result is still not there. So I mean, why still we don't have so much focus on research and innovation? But innovation is now part, and we know that innovation is part of the economic return for Europe. But why we are still so blind about the importance of investing in research?
Well, just on our report, again, we have limitation of time and limitation of space, so we weren't able to go into this in great detail, but it is there in the, to some extent, it would be mentioned somewhat, and it certainly, people know that the innovation that we're talking about needs an ecosystem around it. We don't, you know, unless you have a successful ecosystem, you're not going to have the research progress, the progress needed to deliver beneficial innovations. So I'd go back, actually, I'd refer to Norway on this one as an example. So many years ago, I copy-edited a book about Nicolet, Power of Contrast, written by Knut Sanger and Ralph Petter Andam. And the book described the technological breakthrough that gave rise to contrast media and made Nicolet a very successful company that was later bought up by multinationals. And the story of the success was excellence, scientific excellence within the company's own research department, links to an ecosystem of excellent research in the university sector, and then the company's own business knowledge and ability to negotiate the business environment at the time. That was a successful formula in that case as part of the pharmaceutical revolution. And plainly, this is a formula that works, that research excellence is part of it. We would also say, and we do refer a little bit on the health side here, about the benefits of international collaboration on health research. So one of the kind of the gain multipliers that you could develop, we don't develop it very much as a subject. I think it'd be a good thing to do another report to analyze threat multipliers and gain multipliers and develop strategies around that. But you can see that, reduced geopolitical conflict helps towards international research collaboration. And it was international research collaboration that delivered the COVID vaccine much, much faster than anyone foresaw at the time. Equally, if we divide into different camps and break up, and put barriers in the way of international research collaboration, we are kind of reducing the possibilities of making the kind of breakthroughs that can deliver us better solutions in future. So these things are linked together. Part of this report is about trying to understand and reinforce the interdependence between different trends. And that's certainly a message that we want to convey through this report, that we're not living in a world where what happens in geopolitics is not related to even what happens in research, and probably vice versa.
Okay, we have reached the end of our hour. Just a short information for you. We are now, the 1 hour with Europe is going on holiday. July and August, we are not going to have any guests. We are already working for our September appointment, so stay tuned. I hope you found it interesting. I would like to thank again Eamonn Noonan that has spent 1 hour with us. I hope you found it interesting. Stay in touch with us and see you at the next appointment of 1 hour with Europe, organized by the Brussels office. Have a nice week.